The Juneau World Affairs Council, in collaboration with KTOO, presents the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. In this lecture, the intellectual, social, and cultural origins of contemporary political authoritarianism, Dr. Peter Knutson poses questions about the increasingly authoritarian character of institutions and attitudes in 21st century United States.
Okay, so thank you, Juneau World Affairs Council, for putting this on. What you're doing is the kind of civic action that's critical to any democracy. I mean, what we look at for a democracy is active civil society. And so that's what this is about. You need to create spaces for dialogue. And that's really the measure of any healthy society. So, okay, sorry for the sort of pretentious title for this talk. That I think I was up late at night and I was just trying to capture a bunch of things, but I'll try to be a lot more concrete than this abstract title. I don't claim to be Max Weber or something, you know, sociologist. If you read my little bio blurb, you'll see that I've actually had two careers in my life. I've been a commercial fisherman for 50 years, up until about 2 years ago, here in Southeast Alaska and in Puget Sound. I've worked as a subordinate, as a crewman. I've run boats, fished salmon and halibut. I was a fisherman before I was an anthropologist. And and then I've been a teacher now in the community college system in Puget Sound since 1980, which is, 44 years? Long time. And I'm a real advocate for the community college system. It was initially established in the United States in a big way under the Truman administration. And what's interesting when you go back and you read the Truman Report founding the community colleges, it was not just academic subjects that were going to be taught. One of the key purposes outlined was citizenship, that this is going to augment and help our people be better citizens. And this was really the expansion of higher education for the majority of the population. In Washington State, 60% of our population that goes on to higher ed comes through the community colleges. Community colleges have been a source of democracy in the United States. They've been a source of social activism. I remember one time Bobby Seale, if you know who he was, or is, he's still around. Bobby Seale came to my school because Seattle Central, which is where I teach, Seattle Central College, it's sort of the interface between the African American community, the Asian community on Beacon Hill, white working class. Bruce Lee went there. You know, there's a whole history of social activism at this coming together of these places. So we had Huey's not here, but Bobby Seale come and tell us a story about his community college. He went to Merritt College in Oakland, and he said he was sitting in an anthropology class one day, and the instructor was up there going, well, we got these kind of human beings. We got Mongoloids, we got Negroids, and we got Caucasians. And he said he turned to Huey and he goes, wait a second, everybody else is an oid? You know, what about Caucasians, you know? And he said, you know, come on, let's do Caucasoid, right? And I just bring that up as an example of, like, these are two individuals who would not have been in higher education before the community college system. And, you know, and so it's gratifying. I mean, my student body, they are salt of the earth. You know, they're working 30, 40 hours a week. They got families. Some of them are homeless. I've got a high percentage of homeless students. Not high percentage, but maybe at one point or another during the course of the year, maybe 15%. Hey, I'll get you that paper. I'm under a bridge right now. You think I'm exaggerating? I'm not. You know, it's really something to be involved in this, and it's a free atmosphere. That's the one thing. You know, I can get really negative about developments in our country, but I can still teach whatever the hell I want in my classes. I can prescribe any book I want. I've never had a problem, and I think that's appreciated by students, and we take that for granted, and that's not the way it is. Even in the United States, that's not the way it is. You know, there's places in the United States now that are putting restrictions on books, that directly assign textbooks to instructors, and so, you know, we're blessed to have that. My community college is sort of has this glorious legacy of democratic activism. It started, our community college was established in, I think it was late 1960s. And at that time, well, first it was the oldest high school in Seattle, Broadway Edison High School. And then in 1941, something happened, which was the Japanese internment. And they took about 40% of the school, sent them off to the camps. And you know, and then after that, so that's the beginning, and that's still remembered on our campus. In fact, at the center of our campus, we have a sculpture, a water-flowing sculpture that commemorates that, actually. So this is sort of the background. And then they were going to create the community college system, 3 different campuses in Seattle. The suburbs were going to get the academic subjects, and they were going to get the shop classes. Our school was just going to get very introductory level shop classes, no academics whatsoever. And anyways, there was a march out of the Central District, and there was a tear gas shot, and there was a riot. And the Black Student Union said, we want the full array of classes here. And so our school, and the legislature finally responded, the governor responded. So that's how we started. We started with political activism. That's why we have the school we have. And then you go down through the years, and you know, in my time there, Seattle Central was the epicenter for the demonstrations against the corporatocracy running the world during the World Trade Organization demonstration. You know, we would, every day there'd be, you'd smell tear gas coming in. You know, you would, students would bring in rubber bullets. I mean, it was, I had students next to me arrested for carrying gas masks in their pack, because that was illegal to have a gas pack. We were under martial law for about 4 days during that period. Later on, you know, Seattle Central was the center for Occupy. It was the Occupy encampment, you know, really protesting income inequality, which I want to talk about today a little bit as a background to what's going on in the United States. Our campus was epicenter for the demonstrations against the 2003 American invasion of Iraq that ultimately resulted in, I think, 2 million deaths. And we actually were threatened with a cutoff of federal aid to our school by the Bush administration. That was put out. Subsequently, Black Lives Matter. So anyways, civic activism and protest, as well as electoral politics that we're also involved in, is part of our DNA at this school. So it was a school that accepted me after I'd been rejected 30, 40 other places that I'd applied to, you know, because I was politically oriented, I was a generalist. And anyways, so this is where I ended up. And I teach all kinds of courses now. I teach courses on environmental anthropology. I teach biological anthropology every quarter, and I'm going to talk about human biology and democracy a little bit in a second. I teach a course called Anarchy and Anthropology, which anarchy meaning not throwing rocks, not breaking windows, but anarchy meaning without rulers. Okay, it doesn't mean without order, it means without rulers. And so we have a class, and then we have classes on food, work and debt, all kinds of things that are directly relevant to my students. And I try to make my teaching what I would call existential. I call it existential anthropology, where I want you to think about your daily life. You know, existentialism means you make choices in life. That's the core of existentialism. So it's a big responsibility to be an educator. You have a big impact on people's lives. And for many of our students who are immigrants, the community college instructor is like one of the major points of contact with the whole culture. You know, so I've played a role at several funerals at this point, where families come to me after something happens, cancer, something else, and you know, you end up thinking, who am I? I'm just an instructor. What, you know, I'm not a priest, and yet you're put into that role. You have a lot of responsibility, and so when I talk to students about being conscientious, trying to work to maintain your integrity. These are not multiple choice questions. You know, this is something that I want you to take seriously, and I'm gonna show you a picture now. Wait, where's my picture? Why am I not connecting? There we go. This woman was a student of mine over 2 years. And she wrote some wonderful papers. She was the daughter of Turkish immigrants who came to this country. Her dad was a dissident in Turkey. And their home, she told me, was a place where people could come and speak freely. So, but they had to leave at a certain point. I don't know what the political situation was, but apparently it was not good for them. They came to Seattle. They came and they settled in West Seattle in a working class neighborhood. They didn't have any money, lots of stress. Started working while she was going to high school, 15, just like a lot of our students. And just had to help raise the rest of the kids, single parent family. So, yeah, she took my course where we read works by Harold Pinter. We read works by Ursula Le Guin. You know, and these were all, we read Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest, which was an allegory about the Vietnam War. And it was about imperialism and exploiting another planet, basically. And we listened to Harold Pinter's Nobel address, which was quite controversial. It's called Art, Politics, and Truth. And he talked in there a lot about US foreign policy vis-a-vis Nicaragua and the support for the Contras. And her name was Ayşenur Ezgi Agi. And last time I heard from her, she wrote me and she wanted my reading list from that class. Went back to all those things. And then the next year, she matriculated and went to the University of Washington. And she got her degree last year from the University of Washington. She was an organizer for the encampment they had in support of human rights for Palestinians. And we have the Northern Lights in Seattle this summer. I mean, you guys get them up here all the time, but so she was out with her friends at Alki Beach, her favorite hangout in West Seattle, just out there looking at the Northern Lights. And a week later, she left, and she was with a group called the International Solidarity Movement. And she went to a place where people had no civil rights, no human rights. Sorry, I'll get through this. People who their land was being stolen, they were being shot, they were being imprisoned without charges. And she was taking these lessons that we talked about in my class and putting her body on the line. As an observer, you know, she was not doing anything provocative. She just wanted to go over and defend these villagers who were being thoroughly oppressed. And another colleague of mine was with her, and she'd only been in Palestine for about a day, 2 days maybe, and she was far away from any action, and there were soldiers up on the hill. And one soldier, sniper, just took a bead on her and shot her precisely through the head, killed her. And one of the villagers said that the guy was dancing. You know, he had a direct hit. So, yeah, how do I feel about that? I mean, I feel guilty in a couple ways. When I say it's a responsibility to be an educator, I mean, part of it's like the lessons you're talking about here. You're talking about democracy. You're talking about freedom. You know, people get killed when they take those things seriously, when they're not just political, words. She took it seriously. And she went out there and she put herself on the line, you know. All I've got now is her papers. She left her papers with me. I go back and I read those papers, and they're heartbreaking. I mean, the integrity is just amazing. I just can't believe it. So, and I also feel guilty because a tiny portion of my salary as a community college teacher went to pay for that bullet that killed her. You know, that bullet was part of the $23 billion that my country sent over there, along with 2,000-pound bombs, to drop on those people. And so, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to start with that because it's, you know, this is, when we're talking about democracy and we're talking about civil rights, these are real issues. These are life and death issues, you know, and we are, whether we like it or not, we are, I won't say complicit. We don't have to be complicit, but we are involved in the world, you know, and we need to be aware. You know, sometimes I have my students read a short story by Joseph Conrad called The Secret Share, which is about, I think it's an English captain, you know, on English boats, these big boats, they have a class system. And it's very difficult for the elites, the upper class, to hang out with the lower class. And so they have psychological problems. In fact, that's why Darwin got sent on the Beagle, because the skipper, Fitzroy, was having psychological problems, and Darwin was sent as his companion, because they were the same social class, to kind of keep him sane. Well, anyways, back to the Joseph Conrad. So Conrad profiled this skipper who was losing his mind. And I remember there's a quote in that story where the skipper goes, "It was worse than being mad because one was aware of it." And so this is what I ask my students: is it better to be aware or not be aware? You know, that's the fundamental question about education, isn't it? Do you want to be aware or do you not want to be aware? Sometimes being aware is really, really uncomfortable. Yeah, existential anthropology, that's what I do. You know, I try to get students to think about their own lives, to think about the things that they know but they don't realize they know. I mean, one of the things that they're all going through is they go to work, and typically they go to work in situations where they have to sell their body or they have to sell their time. They sell their body in all kinds of ways. They sell their time, and in some ways, you go to work, or maybe even you go to high school, and just to get through it, you kind of turn your brain off. And so what I'm trying to do is to get them to turn the brain back on to that experience what are you going through here? What is going on? And I think part of the reason that I can do that is that I do have a working class background, and so I share a lot of stories. I mean, in a way, teaching is about telling stories, the most effective teaching, I think. And so I have lots of stories from fishing in Southeast Alaska and fishing in Puget Sound. In fact, I wrote my dissertation about working on a purse seiner up here for 6 years. And I worked for a guy who had an 8th grade education. Not that that makes any difference. He was a brilliant man. And he was a good fisherman. I fished for, 6 years, 7 years with him? But he had a big problem. He just couldn't stay away from the booze. So we'd go out fishing and boom, he'd drink a case of beer in a day. And if it was big hauling, maybe a little whiskey in the afternoon. And he could sustain that for the first few years that I was on the boat, but at a certain point it caught up to him. Couldn't get up in the morning. Gear wasn't getting repaired. I almost got decapitated when Big Hauser exploded because he wasn't repairing the gear. And if you're ever in a situation that's crazy, and you feel like you're going nuts, the way you cope with it, for me, is you have a pen and you start writing. Because you're objectifying it, you're externalizing it, and then you can think about it. And so it was good money, compared to other jobs that were available in my hometown at that time. And so I would keep a little notebook in my rain gear, and crazy stuff was happening all the time. And I was really focusing on power, language, and authority. When you're on a boat and you talk about authoritarianism, it focuses you. And so I started thinking about this a lot. And I started reading the marine literature on authoritarianism. There's a lot of marine literature on authoritarianism because when you're on a boat, you've got no place else to go. If you're working a job at home, you work, and then you go home and you decompress. Go home and hang out with your friends, whatever. When you're on a boat, you're just focused. When you're on a boat, everything becomes symbolic. The way a guy throws his lighter on the table, on the galley table, what do you mean by that? It's you get what we call crispy, and so I started watching things happen. One day we were hauling the purse seine over the side, and the net snagged up on a davit, and it started ripping, and the skipper's son. There were 5 of us on the boat, skipper's son and 3 of us. He yelled at his dad. He goes, "Turn it off, turn the hydraulics off." And the dad, his kid just yelled at him. He jumped, and before he realized what happened, he turned the hydraulics off and stopped the net ripping. But then he realized his kid had just yelled at him. And so he turned to his kid and he goes, "Don't you yell at me, you son of a bitch." And he turned the hydraulics back on and ripped about 20 foot of net. Crazy. But this is kind of like authoritarianism. When there's no, what I would call guardrails. When you're home, there's all kinds, you're in civil society, there's all kinds of guardrails that can ameliorate things. When you're in the isolated situation, everything can become really unmoored. And so I saw other things happen on the boat. I saw scapegoating happening. Usually it was the cook. Because the cook's a feminine role, right? Nobody wants to be in the feminine role. I hear all the homophobia. Because the idea of a gay guy on the boat, gay is being identified with being vulnerable, being exploited. And so I watched, and it wasn't always as bad, but it ended up that way. And then ultimately, things got so bad that we quit on the grounds, and we forced the boat in. And it was not mutiny on the Bounty. This is like an ugly divorce, because you're from the same community as these people, but you just realize that, So these are the things I was writing about, and this is what I wrote my dissertation about. My dissertation was in two voices. One was the voice of the crewman, and the other was the analyst taking a look at it. And I was always struck with the way language got used on these boats, and the way you had to maintain two faces, one in public and then the other one down in the forecastle. There was two voices. So, yeah, these are the kinds of lessons that I'm talking about to students. And I say to my students, for example, have you ever had a boss order you to do what you're already doing? I call it ordering the obvious. They all get it. They all know exactly what I'm talking about, And so I'm bringing these lessons back home to them in an existential way. This is, in fact, what I do now is, what I did with my dissertation is called an autoethnography, which is not autobiography. Autobiography is when you're, kind of just writing about the idiosyncrasies of your life. Autoethnography is when you're doing that, but you're also trying to fit and understand your life in terms of larger social patterns and how it fits in. It's not easy because, Margaret Mead or somebody could, or my fellow grad students, they could go from grad school and say, oh, I'm going to go to Nigeria and do 6 months and write a dissertation. You go into a place for 6 months, you barely even know the language, and then you come back and you can make big generalizations about the culture. In fact, that's why Margaret Mead was later attacked. But when you're living with people and you're writing about your own context, it's much more difficult because you always think about counterfactuals. In anthropology, that's what Zora Neale Hurston did. She wrote about her own culture, and she was kind of demeaned by other anthropologists for that for a long time. So I get students to write about their own lives. I say, give me a text, and I've got one of my texts I use now in the book, in the class. It's now about a 300-page book of autoethnographies by my students, which is now the text for new students. And so they read about work, selling the self, creepy men. They read about imprisonment. They read about domestic violence. And it's all in their voice. And so when the students read it, they go, wow, that's me, that's me, that's me. So that's kind of what I do, and that's how I approach anthropology. I was going to mention a couple other things about maritime literature, since I mentioned Conrad. Of course, Melville, the classic. And I love the scene in Moby Dick where Ahab is saying to the ship's carpenter, I think he's making a casket. He's doing something with his hand. Anybody recall that scene? And when you're in a hierarchy like that, the whole point is to say as little as possible. It's like when you're being interrogated, and the carpenter goes, "Oh, I mean nothing, sir. I just do as I do." I mean, talk about language and power and authoritarianism. Or you think of Richard Henry Dana, 2 years before the mast, about a furring ship that's off the coast of California. And again, isolated, and the captain is complete, cruel, vicious, sadistic, and he's whipping a guy on the boat for some infraction. And another guy goes, "Why are you whipping that guy?" And then the captain says, "Okay." And then he has that guy whipped. And he goes, "You know why I'm whipping him? Because I enjoy it, that's why." No accountability. You're in a situation where there's no accountability. And it's this celebration of cruelty that's one of the characteristics of fascism. They love that sort of celebration of cruelty that we see in the culture. And then, of course, I think of Ulysses' Odyssey. And, it's interesting, isn't it, always how the ship is sort of the emblem of the state? And he's got to get through these 2 rocks past the sirens. And the sirens are out there just singing their alluring song, trying to lure the boat onto the rocks. And so he has the crew's ears plugged up so they can't hear. But his ears aren't. And he orders himself strapped to the mast. And so in some ways it's a metaphor for a dominating society in which you want to keep the population's ears plugged up. The rulers, they can hear the alluring sign, but they have to stay true to the shareholders, right? And so there's so many lessons that you can draw from this literature. It just becomes so clear. I tell other stories. Like one time we were bringing the purse seiner up in the ocean. We were off of Queen Charlotte Sound, middle of British Columbia. Actually, this was a friend of mine, and he was on a boat, brand new skipper, kid about his age. I don't know, he was probably around 22, 23, first time he'd ever run a boat. This was back in the days where we didn't have radar. Okay, I think they had a dip sounder, but no radar. So they're out in Queen Charlotte Sound, and all of a sudden the fog comes rolling in, and they can't see anything, and they can hear waves crashing on Iron Rocks, which is one of the big rocks sitting way out there. And the skipper, the young kid, just goes to his bunk and lights up a cigarette. And he leans back in the bunk, and the guys are all going, "Hey, what do we do?" And he goes, "It's all over, boys. We're done for." And my buddy and his friends said, "You may be done, but we ain't done." And so, it was like there's this residual drive. They took over. I mean, I've seen that again and again. Part of the problem with authoritarianism is that you're in denial. This can't really be happening. I sunk my boat one time, middle of the night, and that's the first thing before you even think about a survival suit. You think, "No, this can't be happening. This can't be real." I had a deckhand run on the rocks, British Columbia, at 9 o'clock in the morning, full speed. And that's the first thing you've got to tell yourself is, this is real. You better grab it. This is where we're at in the United States today. I mean, when I'm talking about the lack of safeguards or the lack of guardrails, we're losing guardrails in the United States left and right, and it is happening. And we have to not be in denial about this thing. The question last time was, are humans inherently authoritarian? I think something like that. And let me just do a little biological anthropology riff on that. I mean, when you look at human evolution, we go back to our closest cousins in the animal kingdom. You've got 2 different types of chimpanzees. We separated from them about 5 million years ago, if you believe the evolution story. I tell my students, you don't have to believe this, you just have to know it for the test. Okay, so you got chimpanzees that Jane Goodall studied, and come to find out after a lot of observation, they can be murderous. The males can even eat their own babies. And so that's one type of chimpanzee. Is that human nature? Like Hobbes says, nasty, brutish, and short. Man is a wolf to man. That's one model. And then equally related to us are the bonobos, who are make love, not war. That they just use sex as a greeting, And it's like, are we the bonobos or are we the chimpanzees? The point is, as humans, because we have culture, we could be either one. It's our culture. We are plastic, but if you look also at chimpanzees, one thing you notice about chimps and gorillas and orangs is, especially in the males, they have massive canines, great big canines. And those canines are not there for diet, because if they were, then the females would have them too. They are there to enforce a dominance hierarchy. And one of the things that you notice as you track human evolution, as we take a look at hominids, the first bipedal apes, our ancestors, is that you start seeing this progressive shrinking of the canines. And you start seeing less and less difference in size, sexual dimorphism between males and females. And as we track human evolution, what we see is that we're not fast, we're not vicious. The only advantage we've got is we can communicate, okay? And so I think the story of human evolution from a biological standpoint is increasing communication until we finally get to language. And back to the boat and language. There's a reason why words and language are considered threats in authoritarian context. I mean, watch Full Metal Jacket or go to boot camp. And you'll see you don't speak to your superior because language assumes that two people can have a dialogue. It's an assumption. If I speak to you, we are on the same level. We're in the same community. And so that's why I think humans are not inherently authoritarian, because we have within us an expectation of reciprocity. In fact, there's a German philosopher named Habermas who makes this point all the time, that essentially that's the liberatory aspect of humans is our language. It always presupposes reciprocity, even if we're in a dominating situation. And so, you know, this is a guy who was in the Hitler Youth in World War II, and he's very concerned about the breakdown of civil institutions because he watched it happen. And so he constantly says, you need to expand the areas in which you can have civil conversation, in which you can institutionalize communication. That's our best hedge against authoritarianism. So that's why I don't think humans are fundamentally authoritarian. They can be in a certain context. And this is the same point that Erich Fromm makes in, what is it, Fear of Freedom? Escape from Freedom. You know, that's exactly the same point he makes, is that human potentials are actualized depending on the social situation that they're in. Things can go in a certain direction. When we're talking about accommodation to a totalitarian society, I oftentimes for my students break down what the German philosopher Hegel called the master-slave relationship. And I'll just break it down briefly for you. Is that basically Hegel says, you know, in the process of coming to awareness of the world, there's a situation in which you have two individuals who are fighting for recognition. And eventually one person wins, and the other person can either give themselves up and become a slave or die. And so once you create an enslaved person, Hegel says he has this assumption that humans are essentially people, they're individuals that want freedom, that desire freedom. And so he says if you're enslaved, you will keep that idea of freedom alive in your head. He calls that stoicism. Now, I used to see this on the boat all the time. We see it everywhere. People dissociate. They want to tune out. You know, they want to pretend they're free in their head, right? But then Hegel says, and my students get that. They know exactly what I'm talking about. And then the next step is that Hegel says, after a while, you can't sustain that illusion of freedom, you know, that you're just living in the mass media, that you're living someplace else. And so at that point, you begin to say, well, yeah, we're screwed. Society is screwed. There's nothing you can do about it. And so you become cynical. So that's the next step beyond stoicism. And then the next step beyond cynicism is you take the master's consciousness inside your own head and you reproduce it. You're at a job and you've had to put up with the abuse for a long time. Somebody new comes in, they haven't heard the bad news yet. And you feel like, I had to go through that, now it's your turn. And so you can see, this is the progression when you don't fight back. I mean, Hegel says, if you're going to escape this slavery, you have to risk life at some point. You have to risk life. That's the existential moment that all the existentialists branch off of. And then finally, Hegel says, once you've internalized that master's consciousness, then you're constantly trying to become like the master. And he calls that the unhappy consciousness. I'm constantly, and I'm always sinful. I never quite make it. It's part of that same dynamic. And you become unhappy. And this is when Fromm talks about fascism. And you have that sense of low self-worth. And you're trying to project yourself into this oceanic, as Freud would call it, ideal community. This is education. And I think this is the way that it works for people, is when you tie, and then they want to read this stuff, as opposed to teaching it as a dead letter. All right. I better pull it back together here. I got too much stuff to cover. So I would say that, and then, okay, let me give you one more anthro story. It's called Christmas in the Kalahari. I don't know if anybody's ever read that short story. It's not a short story. There was a Harvard anthropologist working with the Kung San people, and he'd been with them for a year. And they were poor, and he was rich by their standards. He had all these canned goods, he had meat, and he would try to share. Of course, it was not reciprocal because they really didn't have those same kind of goods to share with him. You want information from your informant, you give him some gifts and so forth. So at the end of his stay, it was Christmas, and he wanted to throw a big feast to show his appreciation. So he went out and he found the biggest, fattest cow he could find. And he said, they're going to love this because I know they love that stuff. And so he purchased it and went to the village elders and said, look, I got this great big fat animal. You guys it's dripping with fat. You're going to love it. And they said, how can you insult us with this scrawny piece of crap? And he was like, and they just said, get out of here. Okay, we'll take it. And so he was kind of crestfallen, and he goes, yeah, God, I don't even want to go to the party. I didn't even want to go to the Christmas party. And they said, no, you better come. So anyways, so they butcher this animal. It's got like 2 inches of fat in the belly, and everything goes off fine. And so he's puzzled. He's not thinking about his own privilege or what he's done. And he goes to them and he said, why did you insult the meat? And they said, this is our practice. When a hunter comes back, we force the hunter we tear down the egoism, because the egoism will destroy the community. And so this practice, and so he understood, this is what they call insulting the meat, and this is the kind of practice you find in traditional societies so they don't fragment. And traditional societies all have different customs to rein in egoism. I mean, the number one saying is share your game. And don't, wait till everybody gets a piece. And of course, we're far from that here in the United States. You look at Seattle. I mean, I see people tweaking out on fentanyl on the street. I see people sleeping everywhere. And yet you've got Medina, you've got Laurelhurst, you've got all this fantastic wealth. And it's sort of like, it's that egoism that has been released in our culture. And that's the guardrail. That is the guardrail for traditional cultures. Ancient cultures, democracy didn't start in 1789. I mean, that was a significant, but you had the Iroquois Confederacy. You had, if you read the book, The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow. Wengrow's a archaeologist, and Graeber's a recently passed anthropologist. They document all kinds of ancient civilizations and farming civilizations that were relatively egalitarian, that clearly had consensual operation, that were maintaining this. It's a potential, but a lot of times the guardrails fall away and you end up with a hierarchical civilization. So, all right, let's talk about insulting the meat in the context of the United States. And where are we at today? And you know, why is our society paying a tax in terms of social disintegration, in terms of school shooting? Why is this happening? Let me show you, and I've got a couple of quick overheads here. Let's see if I can. There we go. So those of you who come from social sciences, you'll recognize this graph as the Gini index. Okay, the Gini index, or it's called the Gini coefficient, is a way to measure inequality in societies. Okay, and if I went down to the very bottom here, it would be 0, which is a situation of complete equality. And if you go all the way up to the top, 1, complete inequality. You know, Elon Musk has everything and nobody else has anything. And so they take this measurement of inequality and they apply it to all societies. You can go online, you can see every society has a Gini index number. And you can track it over time. And that's essentially what's going on here, is that the levels of inequality are being tracked over time. Okay, so here we're back at World War I. Here's 1920. You can see that actually things got a little bit more egalitarian here during war production, right? People were going to work. And then take a look at this point right here, 1932. 1932, we're at about 0.54. And that's getting very high. And what happens is that when you get a high number like that, the capitalist system becomes unstable because effective demand in the population is no longer there. And so, you know, rich people can only consume so many items. And so then what do? Well, then the government has to step in and spend money for tanks, or they could also spend money in hospitals if they wanted to. All right, and then take a look at this. Look at this big decline right here. World War II. Okay, and also you've got FDR. You know, you've got the social programs that got put in place that bailed things out. And we kept coming down, 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 down until we get to the most egalitarian period in American history. What about 1970, anywhere from 1960 to 1980. This is the period of time which characterizes, I think, a lot of people my age or older, their earliest memories. When you had a single person that could go out, have a job, houses, you could buy a house, you could support a family, you could even have a little pleasure boat for the weekend. And we got down to this point right here, and then all of a sudden, look what happens. And I've got another chart. This goes up to 2010. We're still climbing. All right, so what does that do in terms of the politics of the country? You know, well, there's a lot of, there's people are working harder and harder. All of a sudden now both spouses have to go back to work. Now even that doesn't cut it, so you got to start putting stuff on credit cards. This is supercharging the politics in the United States. When we talk about authoritarianism, it doesn't just happen out of nowhere. And so that's a good indicator. I mean, I think a lot of authoritarianism in the population has to do with anxiety. And this is clearly an anxiety-provoking situation. I mean, I look at guys getting in the fishing industry down here. You know, when I was catching sockeye in 1979, $1.40 a pound. Last year, it was maybe $1.25. The year before that, it was 50 cents in Bristol Bay. 1973, we got 32 cents a pound for pink salmon. This year, it was 25 cents. I mean, it's become very, very untenable for the majority of the population in the United States. And then, of course, just like on the boat, the scapegoating starts happening. You know, it's the immigrants. Immigrants are driving up our house prices. I mean, that's what J.D. Vance said in the debate 2 weeks ago, you know. No. All of a sudden, I mean, what happened was that the banks, quantitative easing, they were flooded with money. It didn't go back into the economy. It went to stock buybacks. It went into buying up assets. And so now all of a sudden, instead of college being free here, maybe like it still is in Western Europe, now all of a sudden college is, people have lifetime anchors around their neck in terms of their student debt. So this whole thing is getting, it's accentuating the whole thing. Here's a little extension of this is the Gini index from 1965 to 2020. Now look at this little dip right here. You know what that was? That was the very good COVID relief that got past the first 2 years of this last administration. Childhood poverty got cut 40% by these short programs, and all of a sudden now they're gone. Boom, we're going back up. This is the background, and let me show you one more graph. Distribution, what I just showed you was income. This is distribution of household wealth in the United States. See this little red line right down here? Okay, these are the income groups. This is what the bottom 50% of America owns. This little red line right here. Okay, this is between 50% and 90%. That's what they own. Here is the top 10. Here's the top 10% or the top 9%. Huge. Here's the top 1%. You know, we are going into an incredibly unstable situation. You know, you've got America's a democracy, but it's a democracy overlaid on an economic autocracy, on an economic dictatorship. And is that viable in the long term? I don't think so. I think there's a relationship between economic inequality and political democracy. And I'm not demeaning our political process or the need for political engagement, but I'm saying these issues have to be addressed. And you know, when we talk about guardrails, yeah, we can see now that education's under assault. Okay, what I call, oh man, I'm almost out of time here. What I call the wisdom disciplines, which is the social sciences, the humanities, they're being defunded because they were considered to be part of the problem in the 1960s by the business community. Go back and read the Powell memo of 1971, the Supreme Court justice, corporate lawyer, who wrote the plan for rolling back the campuses, putting in place a lot of the Project 2025. You can see the template was already laid there. Okay, and my last 2.5 minutes, to quote Lenin, what's to be done? You know, what's to be done? Civil society. I mean, I can tell you several political battles I've been in as a fisherman, okay, against big industrial interests in Washington State that we won because we created crazy alliances. We put together an alliance of fishermen, fundamentalist Christians, Sierra Club, Native Americans, and we beat a huge statewide initiative in 1995 by putting that coalition together. You know, you gotta think outside the box. I think of the farmers market movement in the United States, which to me is an example of new civic engagement. That's the new town square. You don't have conversations at Safeway, but if you go to a farmer's market, you're gonna have a lot of them. Back to Habermas, this is how you put communication back together. I look at the wave of union activism now. You know, unions have been on the ropes, and I think right now people are realizing no one else is gonna look out for your interest. You gotta get together. So, anyways, oh yeah, just one more. Life expectancy, here's the United States, here's comparable countries. Take a look at what's happened in the last, I mean, sure we had COVID, but we had a huge hit. That's another marker of the health of a society is your life expectancy. And there's Eisenhower. And so I kind of wanted to end with this and just say, if you don't fight, you know what's going to happen. But if you do fight, you might win, but it might cost you. So that's about all I had on my chest today. So thanks a lot. I appreciate you guys hearing me out.
That was Dr. Peter Knutson discussing the intellectual, social, and cultural origins of contemporary political authoritarianism. It was recorded October 18, 2024 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlingit as part of the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. Produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine,